The New Testament is unquestionably the greatest document ever written. It tells us about salvation, about Jesus Christ. But to properly understand the New Testament, we have to know where it fits into God's master plan. God created mankind for a purpose. And what was that purpose? Why did God make us? What was His purpose in making us? Well, for one thing, God loved us. He wanted us to be His family. He wanted to have fellowship with us. And He gave us a kingdom. God created the physical universe for us. The stars and the moons and everything was made for us. And God placed us in charge of this kingdom. And it was God's desire that we would rule on the earth as He rules in heaven, and that we would live forever, and we would populate this kingdom, and so forth. But through Satan's activities, sin entered the picture, and we lost our position. But God did not give up on His plan, and so He came up with a way to restore the kingdom to mankind, to bring us back to the position we once had. And so we've been looking for several weeks at God's master plan. The steps that God has gone through over a period of thousands of years, at least 4,000 years, God has been working on this. And we see all the intricate details that go into making this work. It's amazing. And we saw that God, first of all, picked a man. He picked Abraham. Because God needed a people. God needed a nation of people. And so He picked Abraham to be the one that would begin this process because of Abraham's great faith. It's interesting, the highest quality that a man can have is his faith. Why is that? Why is our faith the greatest quality God's looking for? Instead of intelligence or skill, it's faith.
Well, He wants us to trust Him.
He wants us to trust Him. Yeah. God says, I just want you to trust me, and I'll take care of things. And so Abraham, through God's miraculous bringing of a child into his life and then so forth, we next saw that God made a nation out of Abraham's descendants. The nation of Israel. Israel was chosen for one particular purpose, and that was to accomplish God's main goal of bringing the Messiah to the earth. The only way that God could redeem and save mankind, His Son had to come to the earth. There was no other way. And so God chose Israel as the chosen people. The next step in God's master plan is He needs a kingdom, because the Messiah is going to be the king. And so God made the nation of Israel, and He put kings in it, because a kingdom must have kings. And one particular king He made a covenant with, King David. And He says, on your throne is going to sit the Messiah. David had no clue what that meant. But he knew that this special one was coming out of his line. And so about 1000 BC, the kingdom of Israel got its start. And then about 930 BC, about 70 years later, the kingdom was divided into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Many of the dates I have on your sheet here are approximate. I didn't try to get them exact up until about number 10. Then I get a little more detail. But about 930 BC, the kingdom was divided into the northern kingdom of Samaria, the southern kingdom of Israel with Jerusalem as the capital. For about 200 years, the northern kingdom was ruled by a series of evil kings. And they fell into idol worship. And they disobeyed God's commands. They rejected God. They turned on God. I think it's amazing that God let them last for 200 years. I mean, of all the evil things they were doing. Finally, God decides to bring an end to the northern kingdom. So we're picking up in number 10 on your sheet. Does anybody need a sheet? I've got some more if you don't have one. In 722, God caused the Assyrians to invade. Sennacherib led the armies of Assyria. I'm sorry, that's not right. The armies of Syria came into the northern kingdom, destroyed Samaria, and they carried off many of the Jews in Samaria into other parts of their empire and scattered them throughout their empire. They then brought in foreigners from other parts of the empire that they had conquered, other nations, and mixed them in with the Jews that were left. And over several hundred years, what effect did this have? Yeah, the Jews had intermarried with these foreigners, and the Jews that had been left in Samaria became a mixed race, and they were rejected by the Jews in the south, and they became what was known in the New Testament as the Samaritans. So that was the origin of the Samaritans. For all practical purposes, the northern kingdom basically vanished from history. The southern kingdom continued on for another 150 years or so. And finally, the southern kingdom also began to fall away from God. Now, they had some good kings and they had some bad kings. But the nation itself began to drift. They began to worship the gods of the Canaanites. They began to worship Baal, Asherah, Molech, and several other of the gods. And God sent prophet after prophet warning them, you must return to God or punishment is going to come. It is a certainty. But they wouldn't listen. And so in 586 BC, this is a signal date in the life of the Jews. In 586, God sent Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, with the Babylonian armies. They had come to Israel 2 or 3 times. In 605, just about 25 years earlier, they had come, and they had put Judah, the southern kingdom, under their control. And Judah had to pay a huge debt, huge amount of money. And the Babylonians stripped, or they took much of the gold out of the Jewish nation. They also took some of the young people back home to train them to be court officials for the Babylonians. Then in 586, the Jews rebelled against Babylonian rule. And Nebuchadnezzar marched the armies of Babylon into Israel. He surrounded Jerusalem, besieged the city, and eventually broke into the city. Thousands of Jews were slaughtered in the streets. The temple and the entire city were leveled. The walls were torn down. The temple was destroyed. The valuables of the temple had all kinds of gold dishes and silver and valuables, and all that was taken to Babylon. The Babylonians had a little different way of dealing with conquered peoples than the Assyrians. When the Assyrians conquered you, they mixed you in with other races. The Babylonians carried off the Jewish nation almost en masse, and they carried them off to Babylon where they were in captivity. Now the Bible talks about the 70 years of captivity. If you've ever done the math, you think that doesn't add up. Because Jerusalem was destroyed in 586, But the first Jews returned in 535. That's not 70 years. That's only 50-something years. But that 70 years is counted from 605 when Daniel and his friends and some of the other Jews were carried off into Babylonian captivity. So that's the 70 years. The prophecy included that entire span of time. But Jerusalem itself was not destroyed for another 20-something years. So the Jews were carried off into Babylon. Again, this is part of God's master plan to work things out. While the Jews were in Babylon, the temple, like I said, was destroyed in 586. So the Jews had no place to worship. So they came up with the synagogue. The origin of the synagogue was in Babylonian captivity. So that's where that came from. Now, the New Testament just starts talking about the synagogue. It doesn't tell us where it came from. There's no synagogue mentioned in the Old Testament. Suddenly in the New Testament, it's there. So that's one of the reasons we need to study this stuff to understand where these things came from. But when the Jews did not have a temple to worship at, they came up with the synagogue as their place of worship and where they trained the children and so forth. So the Jews were in Babylonian captivity. While they were in Babylonian captivity, one of the most extraordinary prophecies of the entire Bible is recorded. In Daniel chapter 2, we have the great prophecy. Now remember, what's God's ultimate goal? What's the central theme of the Bible? Jesus Christ is, but other than that, what does Jesus talk about more than anything else? The kingdom. So it's all about kingdom. Jesus was going to be the coming king, but it's all about kingdom. In Daniel chapter 2, we have the extraordinary prophecy of the coming world kingdoms. This is all, again, part of God's master plan. In Daniel chapter 2, we find out that the king of Babylon has had a dream. He calls in Daniel. Daniel has developed a reputation over the years of being able to interpret dreams. And so Daniel interpreted the dream that the king had. This is Nebuchadnezzar. He was the greatest of all the Babylonian kings. And Nebuchadnezzar dreamed of a giant statue standing out on the plain. And it had a head of gold. It had a chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of brass, legs of iron, and feet of iron and clay. And then a rock rolled down out of the mountain and knocked the statue over and destroyed it and grew to fill the earth. And Daniel says, okay, God has revealed to me the meaning of this dream. And this is the extraordinary prophecy that Daniel revealed. And it fits so closely to God's plan. Daniel said, King Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold. You're the great kingdom. The head of gold represents the Babylonian kingdom. But after the Babylonian kingdom, another kingdom is going to rise and going to take over the world from the Babylonians. Now, he doesn't name that kingdom in Scripture, but we know what kingdom took over from the Babylonians. The Persians. The Persians took over from the Babylonians. Actually, it was the Medo-Persians. Those two joined together. The Bible does name the king of the Medo-Persians that was going to run the Persians because he had God had a job for him to do. And this was Cyrus, thank you. Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great led the armies of Persia. They destroyed Babylon. They figured out a way to stop the water under the wall, and they snuck in under the wall. And so the Persians became the rulers of the world. The Persians took many of the Jews who were in Babylonian captivity to Persia, and they just continued. And so he then said, there will be another kingdom that will knock off the Persians. Who do we know from history knocked off the Persians? That's the Greeks under Alexander the Great. And so he says that is the kingdom of brass. And then in the days of the Greek Empire, the Greek kingdom, there will be a kingdom arise of iron. Who knocked off the Greeks? The Romans. And so the Roman Republic came into power, and the Romans knocked off everybody else, and they took over the world. And said, then there will be a kingdom of iron and clay. The Roman Republic was replaced with the Roman Empire. That's why it's still iron. And so the Roman Empire then became the dominant world power. And said during those days of the Roman Empire, that's when this kingdom is going to show up that's going to take over forever. And which kingdom is that? That's Jesus' kingdom. We also know it as the church. And so he says, this prophecy is just beautiful when you see how it fits into all the details. That's the stone that came down. It says it was cut out not by human hands. In other words, all the other kingdoms were of human design. This kingdom is divine. And so this kingdom knocks out the other kingdoms and takes over. And it will never go away. What happened to the Roman Empire? It fell. It's gone. But the kingdom of Jesus Christ is now here. It fills the world. You can find churches in any country in the world. I have been to the Middle East, I've been to Europe, I've been to South America, and I worship with churches in all those places. You have a thought?
Yeah, the Romans just turned into Italians.
Yeah, that's... Now let's back up just a hair into number 13. Under the Persians, God told the king of Persia, names him by name. One of the few kings named past the Babylonian Empire. He is named, not only is he named, he's named 100 years before he's even born. The book of Isaiah names, what's his name? Cyrus. Man, brain's not working there. Yeah, Cyrus. He names him by name twice. He says Cyrus will allow the Jews to return to Babylon, or to Jerusalem. Now remember, they had been carried off in 586. And in 535, Cyrus is told by God to send the Jews. Now what's amazing is we have the Cyrus Cylinder. It's in the Louvre. It's this clay cylinder, and it's got Persian writing on it, and it tells. It's a statement by the king that God Almighty told him to send these people home. Now he didn't believe in the true God. He worshipped other gods, but he acknowledged. But after that, he probably did. Yeah, yeah, I'm sure he did. That's true. But in those days, most kings and most people believed in territorial gods. The Egyptians worshipped Egyptian gods. The Canaanites worshipped Canaanite gods. And they thought Jehovah was the God of the Jews. That's one of the things that Pharaoh was so upset about when Moses came, says, God said you let my people go. And Pharaoh was upset. Why? Who's Jehovah as far as he's concerned? He didn't deny he was a God. He's not my God. He's a slave's God. Well, if he's a God of slaves, he must not be that great. And Pharaoh believed he was divine. The Pharaohs believed they were gods. And the Egyptians worshipped the sun god, the moon god, the river god, the alligator god. I mean, they worshipped a little bit of everything. But he was highly offended that another god who didn't even belong in Egypt, I mean, he's the god of Canaan, what's he doing down here? How dare he tell me to let these people go? That's why God had to slap him around with 10 different plagues before he got the thought, well, maybe I do need to let him go. What's interesting, what's the common thing about all 10 plagues? You may not have ever thought about this. What's the common thing about all 10 plagues?
They were brought on by Moses.
Well, that too.
That's pretty common.
That's pretty common. But every one of them was an attack on some Egyptian god. The river god, the moon god, the sun god, he made the sun dark, and so forth. Every single one of the plagues was an attack on one of the Egyptian gods. That was deliberate. What's God saying? I'm tougher than any of your gods.
He was showing Israel.
Yes, sir. He was also showing that to Israel. Yes, sir. I am the real God. These others are just fake gods. I can outpower any one of them. So, in 535, God told the king of Persia, Cyrus, I got it right. you send the Jews home. So in 535, Zerubbabel led the first group of Jews from Persia, from Babylonian captivity, back into Palestine. There were 4 separate waves of Jews that returned home. And so they went back, and God told them, you go home, you build the temple first. Why? Because that's where God's presence is. You get this straight. And so then he had to send a prophet to say, what are you doing? You guys are building your houses and your businesses first. You get back to building the temple. I mean, they started on the temple. They built the altar, but then they got busy with their crops and their herds, and God sent the prophet and says, this ain't going to work. You got to get my stuff done first, and then I'll take care of the rest of it. So, Jerusalem and the temple were rebuilt. The nation got going once again. So number 13 down here, in 535, the Persians allowed the Jews to return to Israel and rebuild the city and rebuild the temple because God told them to. Now for another 200 years, everything is going pretty well. And then Alexander rises up in Greece. Now Alexander's father, Philip of Macedonia. It's in the northern part of Greece. Philip managed to unite the Greek city-states. Now, up until then, the Greeks had a bunch of city-states. What were some of the more well-known ones? Athens, Sparta, Thessalonica. There were several Greek city-states. Well, they warred with each other for centuries. Philip managed to unite them and build an army. His son, Alexander, is a brilliant tactician. He takes the army that his father built and conquers the world.
He also built his own city.
And he built his own city, Alexandria in Egypt, But in the 300s, about 330 was when Alexander conquered the world. And he conquered Palestine. And the Jews came under Greek control. Now, Alexander didn't live very long. He was a young man, and he died. And his kingdom was divided among 4 of his generals in the early 300s. So we're still about 300 years away from the birth of Christ. And for the next 100 years or so, there is a struggle for which of these generals is going to rule. One of them ruled in Egypt, one of them ruled in Syria, one of them ruled in Asia Minor. But eventually, the Seleucids, this is one of the generals, his group took control of Palestine. And so the Jews in Israel came under the control of the Seleucids, the Greeks, Seleucids. And then in the 170s, we have a Seleucid king come to the throne. Now, Alexander was a great apostle of Hellenism. What is that? Greek culture, yes. Alexander was a great believer that the Greek culture was superior to all other cultures. Greek became the predominant language of the entire world. It became the language of scholarship, commerce, and so forth. Anybody educated knew Greek. Paul the Apostle knew Greek. This is one of the reasons God selected him to be the apostle to the Gentiles. And so Alexander believed that everybody ought to practice Greek stuff, learn the Greek language, they ought to watch Greek plays, they ought to practice Greek philosophies, the whole schmear. But he never forced it. He encouraged it. The Greeks under Alexander would build gymnasiums and they would build racetracks and all this kind of stuff. But they didn't force it down the throats of the Jews. But this Seleucid king, this Greek king, finally came to the throne in 175, and he decided he was going to force the Jews to accept Hellenism. Well, what would be the biggest impediment to the Jews accepting Hellenism? The worshiping God, yeah. And so he had to get rid of Judaism. So he passed some laws. He said, first of all, if any Jew is found with a copy of the law of Moses, they will be put to death. If any Jew circumcises their boy babies, they'll be thrown off the wall of the temple or off the wall of the city. He went into the temple itself and he sacrificed a pig on the altar. What would that do? Oh, that would defile the whole temple. Because a pig was the most unclean animal imaginable to a Jew. And then to make matters worse, he went into the Holy of Holies and put up a statue of Zeus, a false god, in the temple itself. This is called in Scripture the abomination. You may, when you cross that in prophecy, that's what that's talking about. That time when the Seleucid king, his name was Antiochus Epiphanes. This was when he tried to force the destruction of Judaism. Well, it caused a rebellion, and this, if you've ever heard of the Maccabean Revolt and all that, that's what this is about. Well, eventually, this rocked on for another 100 years. Eventually, in 60 BC, a Roman general led the armies of Rome into Palestine and conquered the Jewish nation. And from that point forward, the Romans ruled the Jews. And so this is all part of God's plan to get. This follows that prophecy of the statue perfectly. The Babylonians were conquered by the Persians, were conquered by the Greeks, were conquered by the Romans. And so now we're in that final period when the Messiah is going to show up. It's amazing how God works all this out in a perfectly orchestrated plan. All these kings, all these nations, all these wars, all these empires, and God's going to fit it all together. And so the Romans took over in 60 BC. Not too many years later, about 40 BC, the Romans have a civil war. And there's a man and his father, Herod the Great. And they were Idumeans. They were not Jews. They were from Idumea. And they were playing the political game with the Romans. In the Roman Civil War, Herod and his father found out they were on the wrong side of the Civil War. So guess what they did? As any good politician would do. They changed sides. They didn't have flip-flops. They changed sides. And they wound up supporting the winning side. So when the winning side of the Civil War took over, they got themselves appointed to be king over Palestine. Now, the Romans didn't really care much about Palestine. Why? They didn't care much about Israel. It was a backwater. It wasn't much wealth. You could tax it all day and you wouldn't get that much out of it. The Romans were much more interested in Asia Minor, in North Africa, in Britain. You know, the Roman Empire stretched all that way. And so the Herods managed to convince the Roman Senate and the Roman Emperor to appoint them as the king of the Jews. And basically the Romans said, okay, if you'll keep peace and collect the taxes, you got it. So that's what they did. So Herod the Great eventually became the king of the Jews. Now remember, he was appointed by Rome. The Jews did not appoint him as king. God did not appoint him as king. He got appointed by Rome. And so he took over. And so he was sitting on the throne when all the pieces of the puzzle start to come together. It's now time for the grand piece of God's puzzle. And what is that? The birth of the Messiah. Now, part of the problem was that by this time, the Jews had an expectation of what the Messiah was going to be. They had been taught for hundreds of years that the Messiah was coming. They even had prophecies that talked about where he would be born and so forth. But by the time Christ showed up, what were they expecting? A king. They were expecting a warrior king. They believed that the day was coming, the grand and glorious day, when the Jews would be raised to all-powerful. They would be given a king, a supernatural king. He was going to rule the earth. He would lead the Jews in a holy war, conquer the world, and the Jews would be wealthy, powerful, happy, and healthy. And everybody else would bow down to the Jews. They really believed this.
They didn't expect theirs to be any less than Persia.
Right,
Greece,
exactly.
Rome.
That's exactly right.
And that's what they were looking
They were looking for. They thought we're going to have a mighty empire like the Babylonians and the Persians. And yes, but ours is going to be greater and last forever because our Messiah is going to be a warrior king from God. And he's going to have miraculous powers. And if you get killed in battle, what happens? He'll raise you from the dead. He'll multiply the fishes and he can feed the army. So the Jews were really expecting this wonderful day of the Lord when he was going to come and take over and rule the world, and they would rule the world. And you remember when after Jesus had picked the apostles, what were they arguing about? Which one of us is going to be the greatest? What do they mean? Which one of us is going to be second in command behind Jesus? Which one of us is going to help him rule the world? I mean, they really thought they were going to be important, powerful, wealthy people. That's why they started following him. Even when they were convinced he is the Messiah. He's going to be the warrior king, and we're going to be second in command of the entire world. And we're going to rule the world, and all these Romans are going to have to bow down to us. How long had the Jews been under somebody's foot? Since 686 BC. For almost 700 years, the Jews were dominated by somebody. And they were sick and tired of it. That's the only way they knew, yeah.
You can understand that.
Well, sure. They had only had brief periods when they were free from somebody's foreign occupation. And now they believe that when the Messiah shows up, we're going to rule the world. We're going to be the most powerful, wealthy, happy people there ever existed. And then what did they get? A carpenter from Nazareth?
Simplicity of it all
Well, yeah.
made no sense.
Well, no. I mean, what was the statement when they heard he was from Nazareth? Can anything good come out of Nazareth? What was Nazareth? It spelled like goaty bow. can anything good come out of Goatee Bow? I mean, they were shocked. How can the Messiah come out of Nazareth? And then when they found out, what's his job?
What was Nazareth exactly?
Where? It was up in Galilee, at the top of Galilee.
Wasn't it Samaria, then?
No, it was beyond Samaria. It was further north, yeah. But Nazareth was a backwoods town. It was common laborers. There were shepherds. They were builders. Common workers. I mean, there was no royalty coming out of Nazareth. There was no important people come out of Nazareth. It was a backwood town. And how did the people in Judea around Jerusalem look at the folks from Nazareth? Peasants. Yeah, they're peasants. They're hillbillies. they're uneducated. And what was Jesus always asked by the teachers of the law? Over and over and over? What's your authority? Where'd you get your authority? They got their authority by studying at the feet of great teachers. And then the Sanhedrin would have to write them out a document that's saying you have the right to teach. Jesus didn't have any of that. He had no credentials. And they kept saying, where did you get the right to say this stuff? They didn't like him at all because they thought, we've got our doctorates. We studied at the feet of Gamaliel. Who'd you study at the feet of? Well, nobody. Nobody? Can you imagine applying for the job as the president of Harvard University and say, well, I've got a 6th grade education. And unfortunately, you're going to have to wait next week to find out how this goes.